Imagine waking up tomorrow to news that the United States and Iran are at war. Not just political tension, not just threats, but a real open war that could reshape the world. What would happen in the first hours? The first missiles, the first cyber attack that turned cities dark? And more importantly, how would this war touch the life of someone sitting thousands of miles away who thinks the conflict has nothing to do with them? Because history teaches one powerful truth: wars between great powers never stay limited. They spread, they change economies, they move refugees, they shake markets, and they rewrite human destiny. In the next few minutes, you will see a deep emotional and realistic history-based vision of what a U.S.-Iran war could actually look like. So don't skip, because the story of this war might be closer to the future than we think. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Lesson: even the fiercest rivalries can change. The United States once fought brutal wars with nations that later became allies. Enemies in one generation sometimes become partners in the next. The future is not written in missiles or battle plans. It is written in choices. Diplomacy is slow. Peace is fragile. But war, once unleashed, moves faster than any nation can control. So when we ask what would happen if the United States and Iran went to war, the answer is both simple and sobering. The war would not belong only to those two nations. It would ripple across the Middle East. It would shake the global economy. It would place millions of civilians in danger. And like every war in history, it would leave behind something far more lasting than victory or defeat. It would leave memory. The memory of cities shattered. The memory of families displaced. The memory of families displaced. The memory of a moment when diplomacy failed and history took the darker path. And perhaps years later, historians would look back at that moment and ask the question we always ask too late: was there still time to choose another way? If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Long before modern headlines spoke of sanctions, nuclear negotiations, or military threats, the story between the United States and Iran was already unfolding, quietly, steadily, shaped by power, pride, and the fragile hopes of nations trying to define their place in a rapidly changing world. Iran is not a young country searching for identity. It is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, a land whose history stretches back thousands of years to the empires of Cyrus the Great and Darius, when Persian power reached across continents. Empires rose and fell on that land, cultures blended, languages evolved, and through it all the Iranian people developed a deep sense of national identity, one rooted in history, poetry, and resilience. By the 20th century, however, Iran stood at a crossroads between tradition and modernity, between foreign influence and national sovereignty. In the early 1900s, Iran found itself caught between the ambitions of global powers. The British and Russian empires exerted enormous influence over its politics and economy, especially because of one precious resource beneath its soil: oil. Oil transformed Iran into a strategic prize. Western companies extracted enormous wealth, while many Iranians saw little benefit. Over time, resentment quietly grew among the public and political leaders who believed their nation deserved control over its own resources. In 1951, a bold and charismatic leader emerged at the center of that struggle: Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a nationalist with a powerful vision. He believed Iran should control its own oil industry rather than allow foreign companies to profit from it. When he nationalized the Iranian oil industry, the decision electrified the nation. Many Iranians celebrated him as a hero who dared to challenge foreign domination. But what appeared as national independence in Tehran looked very different in Washington and London. Western governments feared the loss of strategic oil supplies and worried that instability in Iran might open the door for Soviet influence during the tense years of the Cold War. In 1953, those fears led to a covert operation that would shape the future of U.S.-Iran relations for generations. Working together, American and British intelligence agencies helped orchestrate a coup that removed Mossadegh from power. In his place, the young Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was restored to authority with strong backing from the United States. For Washington, the decision seemed practical, even necessary in the geopolitical climate of the time. But for many Iranians, the memory of that coup became something else entirely: a symbol of foreign interference in their nation's sovereignty. The Shah ruled Iran for the next quarter century, and during those years, the relationship between Iran and the United States appeared, at least on the surface, to be one of close partnership. Iran became a key American ally in the Middle East, receiving economic assistance, military equipment, and political support. The Shah embarked on an ambitious modernization program known as the White Revolution, which sought to transform Iran into a powerful and modern state. Cities expanded, industries grew, and Iran's economy surged with oil revenues. From the outside, the country seemed to be moving rapidly toward prosperity and modernization. Yet beneath the surface, deep tensions simmered. Many Iranians felt the pace of. Change was too fast and too controlled from above. Traditional communities worried that their cultural and religious values were being pushed aside. Political opposition was often suppressed by the Shah's powerful intelligence service, Savak, which gained a reputation for monitoring, imprisoning, and silencing critics. For some citizens, the modernization program began to look less like progress and more like authoritarian rule supported by foreign power. Religious leaders, intellectuals, students, and ordinary workers all began to voice dissatisfaction in different ways. Among those critics was a cleric living in exile, who would soon become one of the most influential figures in modern Iranian history, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From abroad, Khomeini condemned the Shah's government and accused it of corruption, repression, and submission to Western influence. As the 1970s unfolded, the pressure within Iran continued to build. Protests spread across cities, demonstrations grew larger and more intense. What began as scattered unrest eventually transformed into a nationwide movement demanding change. By 1979, the Shah's government collapsed under the weight of revolution. The Iranian Revolution was not just a political shift, it was a moment of profound transformation that reshaped the identity of the country itself. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile, he was greeted by millions who saw him as the leader of a new era. The monarchy that had ruled Iran for decades was abolished, and in its place, the Islamic Republic of Iran was established. For many Iranians, the revolution represented independence from foreign influence and a return to cultural and religious authenticity. For the United States, however, the revolution brought uncertainty and fear about the future of one of its most important allies in the region. Those fears deepened dramatically Later that same year, in November 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They seized the building and took dozens of American diplomats and staff hostage. The crisis shocked the world and quickly became one of the most defining moments in the history of U.S.-Iran relations. For 444 days, the hostages remained captive as the world watched the standoff unfold. In the United States, the crisis dominated national attention. Night after night, Americans followed the news, waiting for signs of resolution. The event left a lasting scar on the American public and political leadership. Inside Iran, however, the embassy takeover was viewed by many as a symbolic rejection of decades of foreign interference. The building itself was often referred to as the den of spies, reflecting the deep mistrust that had developed between the two nations. When the hostages were finally released in 1981, the damage had already been done. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran were severed, and the relationship between the two countries entered a long era of hostility. Throughout the following decades, tensions appeared again and again in different forms. The United States imposed economic sanctions aimed at limiting Iran's influence and restricting its access to global markets. Iran, in turn, pursued policies that often challenged American interests in the Middle East. Regional conflicts, political disagreements, and mutual suspicion hardened the divide. Each nation interpreted the actions of the other through the lens of history. America recalling the embassy hostage crisis and regional security threats, Iran remembering the 1953 coup and years of foreign influence over its politics. By the early 21st century, the conflict had taken on a new dimension centered on Iran's nuclear program. Iranian leaders insisted they're nuclear. Our activities were intended for peaceful purposes, such as energy and scientific research. The United States and several other nations feared those activities could eventually lead to the development of nuclear weapons. Negotiations, sanctions, and diplomatic efforts moved in cycles of tension and compromise. Agreements were reached, questioned, withdrawn, and debated again as both sides struggled to balance security concerns with the possibility of cooperation. Through all these decades, one truth remained constant. The relationship between the United States and Iran was never defined by a single event, but by a chain of moments, each shaped by history, memory, and the enduring belief of both nations that their path was justified by the lessons of the past. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Wars in the modern world rarely begin with a dramatic announcement or a formal declaration. More often they begin in silence, in intelligence briefings, intense phone calls between leaders, in radar screens glowing late at night as analysts search for signs of movement. If a war between the United States and Iran were to begin, it would likely unfold in this quiet and uncertain way where suspicion slowly turns into action. The first phase of such a conflict would almost certainly begin long before the first missile was launched. Intelligence agencies on both sides would already be watching each other closely. Satellites would scan military bases, naval fleets, and missile sites. Cyber units would probe networks for weaknesses. Every signal, every message, every unusual movement would be studied carefully. In the modern age, war often begins in the digital world, where hackers and cyber operators attempt to disrupt communication systems, power grids, financial networks, and literary infrastructure without firing a single shot. Cyber attacks could be among the earliest signs of conflict. Critical systems controlling electricity, transportation, or communications might suddenly fail. Banks might experience disruptions. Military command networks could be targeted in an effort to create confusion and slow the opponent's response. Both the United States and Iran have invested heavily in cyber capabilities, recognizing that digital warfare can cause enormous disruption while remaining difficult to trace or publicly confirm. As tensions escalate, military forces across the Middle East would quietly move into position. The United States maintains a network of bases throughout the region, including airfields, naval ports, and logistical hubs in countries such as Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. These installations host thousands of American personnel and serve as launching points for aircraft, ships, and defensive systems. Iran, meanwhile, has developed a strategy designed to compensate for the overwhelming conventional military power of the United States. Rather than relying solely on large armies or traditional air forces, Iran has focused on asymmetric capabilities, tools that can strike quickly, unpredictably, and across wide distances. Among these are ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and armed drones which can reach targets throughout the region. The first visible military exchange could begin with a sudden strike on strategic infrastructure. Iranian missile forces might launch salvos toward American bases or naval vessels operating in the Persian Gulf. At the same time, drone swarms could target radar stations, fuel depots, or air defense systems. These attacks would aim to disrupt American operations in the opening hours of conflict. American forces, equipped with advanced detection systems, would attempt to rept oncoming threats using missile defense systems stationed throughout the region. Patriot batteries, naval interceptors, and other defensive technologies would attempt to stop the incoming missiles before they reach their targets. Yet even the most advanced defenses cannot guarantee perfect protection when faced with large numbers of simultaneous launches. Within hours of such attacks, the United States would likely respond with overwhelming air power. Carrier strike groups positioned in nearby waters would begin launching fighter jets, electronic warfare aircraft, and reconnaissance planes. Long-range bombers stationed far from the battlefield could also enter the conflict, flying missions that might span thousands of miles. These aircraft would focus on disabling Iran's military infrastructure. Missile launch sites, radar systems, command centers, and air defense batteries would become primary targets. Precision-guided weapons would be used to strike these facilities, attempting to weaken Iran's ability to launch additional attacks. Iran's military doctrine has long anticipated such a response. Over the years, the country has constructed underground missile facilities, hidden storage depots, and hardened command centers designed to survive airstrikes. Many launch platforms are mobile, allowing them to move quickly between locations and reduce the risk of being destroyed. In the early stages of war, Iranian forces might attempt to launch as many missiles as possible before their launch infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. This strategy would aim to overwhelm defensive systems and demonstrate that Iran retains the ability to retaliate even under heavy attack. Naval forces would also play a critical role. The waters of the Persian Gulf are narrow and crowded, filled with commercial shipping routes and strategic choke points. Iran's naval strategy relies on fast attack boats, naval mines, anti-ship missiles, and small submarines capable of operating in shallow waters. Rather than attempting to confront the powerful U.S. Navy directly in open battle, Iranian naval forces would likely rely on swarming tactics and surprise attacks. Small, fast-moving boats could attempt to approach larger vessels, launching missiles or torpedoes before quickly retreating. Naval mines could be deployed in shipping lanes to disrupt traffic and threaten military ships. The United States Navy, one of the most powerful maritime forces in the world, would respond with advanced surveillance systems, helicopters, drones, and escort vessels designed to detect and neutralize such threats. Helicopters, drones, and escort vessels designed to detect and neutralize such threats. Yet the complexity of the environment would make operations extremely dangerous, with civilian ships and oil tankers sharing the same waters as military fleets. Airspace across the region would become crowded with aircraft conducting surveillance, refueling operations, and combat missions. Electronic warfare units would attempt to jam enemy radars and communications, while intelligence aircraft would gather real-time information about troop movements and missile launches. At the same time, the conflict would not remain limited to conventional weapons. Iran has built relationships with various allied groups and militias throughout the Middle East. In the event of war, these groups could open additional fronts by launching rocket attacks or targeting American forces and allies in neighboring countries. This broader network would complicate the battlefield. What began as a confrontation between two nations could quickly expand into a regional conflict, involving multiple actors operating across several countries. Meanwhile, leaders in Washington and Tehran would face enormous pressure from their military commanders, political advisors, and domestic audiences. Decisions would need to be made quickly, often based on incomplete information. Every new strike would carry the risk of escalation, pushing the conflict into deeper and more dangerous territory. Communication channels between the two governments would likely be minimal or non-existent. Without direct dialogue, misunderstandings could easily grow. A defensive action might be interpreted as preparation for a larger offensive. A limited strike might be perceived as the beginning of a broader campaign. In such an environment, the pace of events would accelerate rapidly. Military operations could expand from a handful of strikes into sustained campaigns involving hundreds of aircraft, naval vessels, and missile systems operating simultaneously across the region. The modern battlefield moves with extraordinary speed. Satellites transmit images in seconds. Commanders issue orders across continents instantly. Weapons travel at supersonic speeds, leaving little time for reflection once decisions are made. What begins as a calculated response to a perceived threat can quickly become a chain reaction of actions and counteractions, each step narrowing the space for diplomacy and widening the scale of conflict. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. If a war between the United States and Iran were to unfold, the battlefield would not be confined to a single country or a single front. The geography of the Middle East, with its narrow waterways, densely populated cities, and fragile political alliances, means that any large conflict between these two powers would spread quickly across the region. The war would not simply be fought over Iran's skies or its deserts. It would stretch from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Afghanistan, touching multiple nations whose stability is already delicate. At the center of this potential battlefield lies Iran itself, a vast and rugged country whose terrain has shaped the strategies of armies for centuries. Iran's landscape is dominated by mountains, deserts, and plateaus, making large-scale invasions extremely difficult. Throughout history, invading forces have struggled to navigate its geography. These natural defenses have influenced Iran's military planning, encouraging strategies that rely on mobility, hidden infrastructure, and layered defenses rather than direct confrontation with stronger adversaries. If conflict erupted, American Airpower would likely focus on military infrastructure inside Iran, missile bases, radar installations, airfields, and command centers. These sites are scattered across the country, many of them protected by air defense systems and hidden within mountainous terrain. Iran has spent decades preparing for the possibility of such attacks, building underground facilities designed to protect critical equipment from airstrikes. But the battlefield would not remain limited to these targets. Iran's military doctrine emphasizes regional influence built through alliances with groups and organizations across the Middle East. These alliances form a strategic network that extends Iran's reach far beyond its borders. In Lebanon, the powerful militia and political movement Hezbollah has long maintained close ties with Iran. Over the years, Hezbollah has developed a large arsenal of rockets and missiles capable of striking deep into neighboring territories. If a war began between Iran and the United States, Hezbollah could be drawn into the conflict, opening another front along the eastern Mediterranean. Rocket barrages, airstrikes, and counterattacks could quickly transform parts of Lebanon into active battle zones. Further west, Syria presents another complex layer to the battlefield. After years of civil war, Syria remains politically fragile. with foreign militaries and armed groups still operating inside its borders. Iranian advisors and allied militias have been active in Syria for years, supporting the Syrian government. In the event of a broader war, these forces could become targets for American or allied military operations, further expanding the conflict across national boundaries. Iraq, positioned directly between Iran and several U.S. military installations, would become one of the most sensitive and dangerous arenas of the conflict. American forces have maintained a presence in Iraq for many years, primarily focused on counterterrorism operations and regional stability. At the same time, various militias within Iraq maintain ideological or logistical ties with Iran. If hostilities erupted, these militias could launch attacks on American bases or supply routes within the country, turning Iraqi territory into a battlefield once again. Such developments would place enormous pressure on the Iraqi government, which would struggle to maintain neutrality, while its land became a corridor for military activity and retaliation. Cities that had only recently begun recovering from years of violence could find themselves once again at the center of a regional conflict. To the south, Yemen could also become part of the wider war. The ongoing conflict there has already drawn in regional powers, and armed groups operating within the country have demonstrated the ability to launch missiles and drones over long distances. If tensions escalated further, attacks originating from Yemen could target shipping lanes or military infrastructure connected to the United States and its allies. Meanwhile, the Persian Gulf itself would transform into one of the most intense operational environments of the war. This narrow body of water is surrounded by 7 aerial nations that host American military bases and strategic facilities. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates maintain close security partnerships with the United States, and many host advanced radar systems, air bases, and naval ports. These installations would likely play critical roles in supporting American operations, making them potential targets for Iranian retaliation. Missile strikes, drone attacks, and sabotage operations could threaten oil facilities, military bases, and urban centers throughout the Gulf region. Energy infrastructure would become particularly vulnerable. The Middle East remains one of the most important energy-producing regions in the world, and many oil fields, refineries, and export terminals are located within range of Iranian missiles. Disruptions to these facilities would not only damage regional economies, but also send shockwaves through global energy markets. The presence of so many actors in such a confined region would make coordination extremely difficult. Airspace would be crowded with military aircraft from multiple countries conducting surveillance, defense patrols, and strike missions. Naval fleets would maneuver carefully through narrow shipping lanes filled with civilian vessels and oil tankers. Every decision would carry risks. A missile aimed at a military base could land near civilian neighborhoods. A naval engagement could take place near commercial shipping routes. A drone strike intended for military infrastructure could damage critical public facilities. The closeness of military and civilian infrastructure throughout the region would make it nearly impossible to isolate the battlefield from everyday life. Regional governments would face difficult choices about how deeply to involve themselves in the conflict. Some might provide logistical support, intelligence sharing, or offensive cooperation. Others might attempt to distance themselves from the fighting to avoid retaliation. Diplomatic relationships would shift quickly as nations tried to protect their own security interests while avoiding direct confrontation. Meanwhile, millions of civilians across the Middle East would watch events unfold with growing uncertainty. For many people in the region, memories of past wars remain vivid. Families who had once fled conflict might once again prepare emergency plans, gathering essential supplies or seeking safer locations. Borders could become strained as refugees attempted to move away from potential combat zones. Aid organizations might struggle to deliver assistance in areas where transportation routes were disrupted or where military activity made humanitarian work dangerous. The region's political landscape, already shaped by years of conflict and shifting alliances, would become even more complex as the war continued to expand. Each new attack would risk pulling additional actors into the struggle, widening the battlefield, and increasing the difficulty of finding any path back to stability. Long before the first soldiers stepped onto a battlefield, the shockwaves of a war between the United States and Iran would begin to ripple through the global economy. Modern wars are not fought only with weapons and armies. They are fought through markets, energy supplies, trade routes, and the delicate balance that keeps the world's financial systems stable. Few places illustrate this reality more clearly than the narrow body of water known as the Strait of Hormuz is not wide. At its narrowest point, it stretches only about 21 miles across, yet it carries one of the most critical lifelines of the global economy. Every day, massive oil tankers pass through its shipping lanes carrying crude oil and natural gas from the energy-rich nations of the Persian Gulf to markets around the world. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates rely on this passage to export their resources. In turn, nations across Asia, Europe, and North America depend on those shipments to power industries, transportation systems, and everyday life. For decades, the strait has been recognized as one of the world's most important strategic choke points. Any disruption to the steady flow of energy through this narrow corridor could trigger immediate consequences far beyond the Middle East. If a war between the United States and Iran began, this waterway would almost certainly become one of the most sensitive and contested locations on the planet. Iran's geographic position gives it significant influence over the strait. Its coastline runs along the northern side of the waterway, and its military forces maintain bases and observation posts that overlook the shipping lanes. Over the years, Iranian leaders have frequently emphasized that if the country were threatened or attacked, they possess the ability to disrupt or even close the strait. Such an action would not require the deployment of large fleets or massive naval battles. Instead, Iran could rely on methods designed to create uncertainty and danger for commercial shipping. Naval mines could be placed in key areas of the waterway, forcing ships to slow down or avoid certain routes. Even a small number of mines could create enough risk to cause major shipping companies to halt operations. Fast attack boats operating in coordinated groups could approach large tankers or military vessels, launching missiles or conducting harassment maneuvers designed to intimidate crews and disrupt navigation. Coastal missile batteries positioned along Iran's shoreline could threaten ships moving through the narrow lanes, while drones and surveillance aircraft monitor activity across the water. For shipping companies, even the possibility of such threats could be enough to stop traffic. Tankers carrying millions of barrels of oil represent enormous financial investments, and insurers might refuse to cover voyages through a region that had suddenly become an active war zone. Without insurance coverage, many shipping companies would simply refuse to risk sending vessels into the strait. Within days, perhaps even hours, global energy markets would react. Oil prices are highly sensitive to supply disruptions, especially when they involve major producing regions. Traders watching events unfold in the Gulf would begin bidding up prices, anticipating shortages and uncertainty. Financial markets could swing sharply as investors tried to assess the scale and duration of the crisis. Countries heavily dependent on imported energy would feel the pressure immediately. Many Asian economies rely on Gulf oil shipments for a significant portion of their energy supply. Nations such as Japan, South Korea, and India import large volumes of oil that pass through the Strait of Hormuz each day. Any interruption to that flow would force governments and companies to scramble for alternative sources. Strategic petroleum reserves maintained by several countries as emergency supplies might be released to stabilize markets. Governments could coordinate with international organizations to prevent panic buying and to ensure that energy continues to reach critical sectors of the economy. Even with these measures, the uncertainty created by a sudden conflict in the Gulf would weigh heavily on global financial systems. Energy prices influence far more than gasoline at the pump. When oil becomes expensive, transportation costs rise, manufacturing becomes more costly, and the price of everyday goods begins to climb. Airlines may reduce flights as fuel costs soar. Shipping companies may increase fees for transporting products across oceans. Consumers across the world could feel the effects in the form of higher prices for food, clothing, and basic household items. Stock markets would likely experience sharp volatility as investors attempted to evaluate the economic impact of the conflict. Energy companies might see their shares rise due to higher oil prices, while industries dependent on cheap fuel could suffer significant losses. Then financial institutions would monitor the situation closely, worried that prolonged instability could push major economies toward recession. Meanwhile, governments would face pressure to respond diplomatically and economically. International leaders might hold emergency meetings, seeking ways to prevent further escalation and to keep vital trade routes open. Naval forces from several countries could be deployed to escort commercial vessels through the strait, creating multinational convoys designed to protect tankers from attack. Such operations would require careful coordination. Warships navigating the narrow waters would need to remain alert for mines, missile threats, and fast-moving boats. Air patrols would monitor the region continuously, scanning for signs of new threats emerging along the coastline. At the same time, energy producers outside the Middle East would attempt to increase output to compensate for disruptions in Gulf shipments. Oil fields in North America, Africa, and other regions might expand production, but these adjustments take time. The global energy system is complex, and replacing the volume that normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz cannot happen overnight. Even partial disruption could reshape international trade patterns. Tankers might attempt longer rounds around alternative export terminals. Some countries might seek new energy. Partnerships negotiating emergency supply agreements with distant producers. Infrastructure such as pipelines and storage facilities could suddenly become critical assets in maintaining supply chains. The economic uncertainty created by such a crisis would not remain confined to energy markets. Currency values could shift as investors moved money toward perceived safe havens. International trade agreements might come under strain as governments prioritize domestic stability over global cooperation. For ordinary people living far from the Gulf, the conflict might feel distant at first. The warships and missiles would be thousands of miles away, yet the economic effects would travel quickly through interconnected financial systems, reaching households and businesses around the world. The narrow strait that carries the world's energy would transform from a quiet shipping corridor into one of the most closely watched and heavily guarded waterways on Earth. Its calm surface hiding the tension of a global economy suddenly balanced on the edge of uncertainty. If a full-scale war were to erupt between the United States and Iran, the human cost would stand at the center of the tragedy, as it always does in history. Nations often speak of strategy, power, and victory, but history remembers something else far more clearly: the faces of civilians caught in the shadow of decisions made far away from their homes. Modern warfare is not only fought between soldiers on distant fronts, it is fought inside cities, hospitals, schools, and communities where ordinary life continues until it suddenly cannot. The greatest danger in such a conflict would be the possibility of widespread destruction in urban areas. Many of Iran's major population centers are densely built, with residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, and historical sites standing close to transportation routes, energy facilities, and military installations. When military targets are located near civilian infrastructure, airstrikes and missile attacks carry unavoidable risks. Precision-guided weapons are designed to reduce collateral damage, but history has shown that no technology can completely eliminate the possibility of civilian casualties in war. Hospitals would face particular danger during prolonged conflict. Medical facilities are critical humanitarian zones, yet they are also vulnerable during military operations, especially if fighting occurs within or near populated cities. Medical staff would work under extreme pressure, treating injured civilians, soldiers, and displaced families, while facing shortages of medicine, equipment, and electricity. Emergency rooms could become overwhelmed if large-scale attacks occurred in short periods of time. Children would be among the most vulnerable populations in such a war. Schools might be closed for extended periods as families attempted to keep children safe from missile threats or airstrikes. Education systems could collapse temporarily in regions directly affected by fighting. Psychological trauma would likely spread among young people who grow up hearing air raid warnings, explosions in the distance, or news of relatives living in conflict zones. Displacement would become one of the most visible humanitarian consequences. Millions of people could be forced to leave their homes if military operations expanded across multiple regions. Refugee flows might move toward neighboring countries that are already dealing with economic and political challenges. Border crossings could become crowded with families carrying limited belongings, hoping to find safety away from active combat zones. Humanitarian organizations would attempt to provide aid, but delivering supplies during active warfare is extremely difficult. Transportati on routes could be disrupted by military checkpoints, damaged infrastructure, or security restrictions. Food, clean water, and medical supplies might become scarce in areas experiencing prolonged fighting. International aid agencies would likely call for temporary ceasefires to allow humanitarian corridors to operate. Psychologically, the impact of war extends far beyond physical injuries. Survivors of conflict often carry long-term emotional and mental health effects. Anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and grief can affect entire communities long after the fighting ends. Families separated during evacuation may spend years searching for missing relatives or attempting to rebuild lives disrupted by violence. Military personnel on both sides would also face enormous physical and emotional burdens. Soldiers operating in unfamiliar environments under constant threat of attack must make life and death decisions in seconds. History has shown that prolonged combat often leaves veterans with lasting psychological scars, even when they return home. Global political stability would also be at risk. A conflict between the United States and Iran could attract involvement or support from other powers depending on strategic interests. Diplomatic tensions could rise as countries attempt to protect their alliances, trade routes, or regional security concerns. So, the possibility of accidental escalation would remain a constant danger, especially in crowded military environments where radar signals, aircraft movements, and missile launches occur simultaneously. Technological warfare would introduce additional uncertainty. Cyber operations could target civilian infrastructure such as banking systems, communication networks, or transportation controls. Disruptions to electricity grids could affect millions of people, particularly in urban areas where daily life depends on Net newest power supply, hospitals' water treatment plants, and emergency response systems could be indirectly affected by such attacks. The economic cost of human suffering during war is often difficult to measure, but it is undeniably enormous. Businesses may close temporarily or permanently if conflict disrupts markets and transportation. Workers may lose employment as industries slow production. Families may exhaust savings while attempting to relocate or secure basic necessities. Cultural heritage sites could also be placed in danger. Iran is home to many historical locations that represent thousands of years of civilization. Damage to these sites would represent not only physical destruction, but also the loss of historical memory shared by humanity. International law and humanitarian conventions attempt to protect civilians during warfare, but enforcement during active conflict is extremely challenging. Military commanders must balance operational objectives with ethical responsibilities, yet the chaos of war often creates situations where ideal protections are impossible. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of such a war would be the long shadow it casts after the fighting stops. Even if military operations ended, rebuilding communities, restoring infrastructure, and healing social divisions would require decades of effort. Children who grew up during the conflict would carry memories into adulthood, shaping future generations' perspectives on peace and war. History repeatedly shows that wars do not end when the last shot is fired. They continue living in economic hardship, political mistrust, displaced populations, and silent memories carried by survivors. The true cost of war is not measured only in territory gained or lost, but in human lives altered forever by its presence. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Subcrips, thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and Bizarre Faye.